You're not going to believe what happened when a routine traffic patrol turned into something that would change one officer's career forever. What started as what seemed like a simple traffic stop became a story about snap judgments, hidden prejudices, and how a single decision can have consequences far beyond what we imagine. Stay until the end, because the twist in this story will leave you speechless. Picture this, a quiet Tuesday morning in downtown Atlanta. The kind of morning where everything seems ordinary, predictable. Officer Marcus Johnson had been patrolling these streets for 8 years, and he thought he'd seen it all. He was the type of cop who prided himself on his intuition, his ability to spot trouble from a mile away. At 34 years old, Marcus had built his reputation on being thorough, perhaps too thorough, according to some of his colleagues. Marcus drove his patrol car down Peachtree Street, his eyes scanning the traffic with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. The morning rush was beginning to thin out, and the usual chaos of downtown Atlanta was settling into its midday rhythm. He'd already written 2 speeding tickets and given 1 warning for an expired registration. It was shaping up to be another routine day in what had become a very routine career. That's when he spotted her. A beat-up 2008 Honda Civic, primer gray patches covering what used to be forest green paint, chugged along in the right lane about 50 yards ahead of him. The car's exhaust pipe was hanging slightly loose, and Marcus could see that the rear bumper was held on with what looked like duct tape. But it wasn't the condition of the car that caught his attention initially. It was the driver. Through his windshield, Marcus could see a black woman, probably in her 30s, wearing what appeared to be casual clothes. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and from what he could observe, she seemed to be driving normally, obeying all traffic laws. But something about the combination triggered a familiar response in Marcus. In his 8 years on the force, he'd developed what he considered a 6th sense about people who didn't belong. This woman, driving this beaten-down car through this part of downtown, didn't fit his mental picture of who should be here during business hours on a Tuesday morning. The financial district was full of lawyers, business people, government workers, people with nice cars, people who looked the part. This woman in this car struck him as out of place. Marcus slowed his patrol car slightly, allowing the Honda to maintain its distance ahead of him while he observed. The woman was driving exactly at the speed limit, using her turn signals properly, maintaining safe following distance. Technically, there was no reason to pull her over, but Marcus had learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts were telling him something wasn't right. Maybe it was the way she kept checking her rear-view mirror, though any reasonable person would do that with a police car behind them. Maybe it was the fact that she seemed too calm, too controlled for someone driving a car that looked like it might break down at any moment. Or maybe, if Marcus had been honest with himself, it was simply that she was a black woman in an old car in a part of town where he didn't expect to see either. The radio crackled to life in his car, but Marcus was too focused on the Honda ahead of him to pay full attention. Something about surveillance and maintaining position, but it faded into background noise as he made his decision. He was going to pull her over. Marcus flipped on his lights and activated his siren with the quick, decisive movement of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. In his mind, he was already constructing the justification he'd use in his report. Suspicious vehicle in area of recent thefts. Driver behavior consistent with possible drug activity. Routine traffic safety inspection. The Honda immediately began signaling and pulling over to the curb, which Marcus noted with some surprise. Most people took a few seconds to react, looked around confused, or tried to find a better place to stop. This woman pulled over immediately and smoothly, like someone who knew exactly what to do when being stopped by police. She came to a complete stop, turned off her engine, and placed both hands visibly on the steering wheel. Marcus parked his patrol car behind the Honda, leaving enough distance for safety while ensuring he could see the driver clearly. He took a moment to call in the stop, noting the license plate number and location. The dispatcher acknowledged. and Marcus thought he heard something else come through the radio, but he was already focused on the task ahead. As he approached the driver's side window, Marcus put on what he called his command presence. Shoulders back, hand resting casually but visibly on his service weapon, facial expression serious and authoritative. This was the part of the job he'd mastered, the psychological aspect of police work. Make sure they knew who was in charge from the very first moment. The woman had already rolled down her window by the time he reached it. She sat with her hands still on the steering wheel, looking straight ahead rather than up at him. Marcus noted this behavior too. In his experience, innocent people usually looked up at officers with curiosity or confusion. People who avoided eye contact usually had something to hide. "Good morning, ma'am," Marcus said, his voice carrying the tone of authority he'd perfected over the years. "Do you know why I stopped you today?" The woman turned to look at him then, and Marcus found himself looking into dark brown eyes that seemed remarkably calm for someone who'd just been pulled over. She was probably in her early 30s, with features that suggested she might be from the South, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and professional. "No, officer, I don't believe I was violating any traffic laws," she replied evenly. There was something in her tone that Marcus couldn't quite place, not defiant but not deferent either. It was the voice of someone used to speaking with authority figures, someone comfortable in situations that made most people nervous. Marcus felt his suspicions deepen. In his experience, people who were too calm during traffic stops were often hiding something. Drugs, weapons, outstanding warrants. Something that made them want to appear cooperative while concealing their real situation. "License and registration, please," Marcus said, stepping slightly closer to the window. As the woman reached for her purse, Marcus instinctively adjusted his position to get a better view of the car's interior. What he saw only reinforced his suspicions. The car's interior was surprisingly clean despite its exterior condition. The seats, while worn, were neat and well maintained, but more interesting were the items he could see. A high-end laptop bag in the back seat. What appeared to be professional documents in folders, and was that some kind of radio equipment partially visible under a jacket? The woman handed him her driver's license and registration with movements that were economical and precise. Marcus noted that she kept her other hand visible on the steering wheel without being told, another sign of someone who knew police procedures unusually well. Marcus examined the documents. The license was valid, issued to Sarah Washington with an address in a middle-class neighborhood about 20 minutes away. The registration matched the vehicle, though both were due for renewal soon. Everything appeared to be in order, which frustrated Marcus because his instincts were still telling him something was off about this entire situation. "Ms. Washington," Marcus said, deciding to probe deeper. "This is quite a nice area you're driving through. Do you work around here?" Sarah looked at him directly again, and Marcus caught something in her expression, a flash of what might have been impatience, quickly controlled. "I have business in the area," she replied simply. "What kind of business?" Marcus pressed. "Because I have to tell you, this vehicle doesn't exactly look like it belongs in the financial district. Makes me wonder what kind of business brings someone driving a car like this to a neighborhood like this." It was a loaded question, and Marcus knew it. He was fishing, hoping to provoke a reaction that would give him probable cause to dig deeper. In his mind, he was already constructing the narrative. Suspicious person in vehicle unsuitable for area, evasive answers to routine questions, possible casing for criminal activity. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Marcus could see her jaw tighten slightly. When she spoke, her voice was still controlled, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I'm not sure I understand why the condition of my vehicle or my presence in this area is relevant to a traffic stop. I haven't broken any laws." Marcus felt his authority being challenged, and his response was immediate and instinctive. This was exactly the kind of attitude that confirmed his suspicions. Innocent people didn't question police procedures. Innocent people answered questions honestly and completely. This woman was being evasive, argumentative, and that meant she was hiding something. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Marcus said, his tone becoming more commanding. "I want to take a look at what you've got in here." She glanced at her watch, a movement that Marcus interpreted as impatience, but which carried meanings he couldn't begin to understand. "Officer, I really need to," Sarah began, but Marcus cut her off. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle now. Keep your hands visible at all times." His voice had taken on the hard edge that he used when he felt his authority was being questioned. This was no longer a routine traffic stop in his mind. This was a situation that required control. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, and during that hesitation, Marcus's hand moved closer to his weapon. It was a subtle movement, but one designed to communicate that he was prepared for whatever this woman might be hiding. In his 8 years on the force, Marcus had learned that hesitation often meant guilt, and guilt often meant danger. "Is there a problem, officer?" Sarah asked, still seated in her car but now looking directly at him with an intensity that Marcus found unsettling. "Because I need to be somewhere very important, and this stop seems to be based on—" "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again," Marcus interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Exit the vehicle immediately, or I'll have to assume you're resisting lawful orders." Around them, downtown Atlanta continued its midday rhythm. Cars passed by occasionally, their drivers slowing slightly to observe the police stop with the casual curiosity that such scenes always attracted. A few pedestrians on the sidewalk paused in their conversations to watch, and Marcus was aware of their attention. He'd learned long ago that traffic stops were always performance art to some degree. You had to project authority not just for the person you'd stopped, but for everyone watching. Sarah finally opened her car door and stepped out, movements slow and deliberate. She was taller than Marcus had expected, probably 5'8", and she moved with the kind of controlled precision that he associated with military or law enforcement training. This observation lodged itself in the back of his mind, but didn't override his primary suspicions. "Hands on the hood of the car, feet spread," Marcus instructed, falling back on the routine that had been drilled into him during training. Sarah complied, but Marcus could sense tension in her posture that went beyond normal nervousness about being stopped by police. As Sarah placed her hands on the hood of her Honda, Marcus noticed several things that didn't fit his preconceptions. Her hands were well manicured despite her casual appearance. She was wearing a watch that, while not flashy, was clearly expensive. Her clothes, while simple, were well fitted and made of quality materials. These details created cognitive dissonance with the beat-up car and his assumptions about why she was in this neighborhood. "I'm going to need to search you for weapons," Marcus announced, beginning the pat-down procedure. As his hands moved professionally but thoroughly over Sarah's clothing, he felt something that made him pause. There, under her left arm, was the unmistakable shape of a holstered weapon. Well, Marcus said, stepping back immediately and drawing his own weapon. "Hands behind your head now. You're carrying a concealed weapon." Sarah slowly raised her hands, and when she spoke, her voice carried a note of what sounded like resignation mixed with urgency. "Officer Johnson, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You need to shut up and keep your hands where I can see them," Marcus shouted, his training taking over completely now. A concealed weapon changed everything. This wasn't just a suspicious person anymore. This was a potentially armed and dangerous individual. "Are you licensed to carry that weapon?" "Yes, I am. And I need you to—" "I said shut up!" Marcus's voice carried across the street now, drawing more attention from passers-by. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with potentially dangerous situations, and his mind began running through tactical scenarios. Armed suspect, crowded urban area, multiple escape routes available. What Marcus didn't notice, as he focused entirely on what he perceived as an immediate threat, was the black sedan that had been parked across the street for the past 10 minutes. He didn't see the two men inside that car speaking urgently into radios. He didn't notice that one of them had stepped out of the car and was now speaking rapidly into a cell phone while watching the traffic stop with obvious concern. He also didn't hear his own radio, which had been crackling with increasing urgency for the past several minutes. The dispatcher had been trying to reach all units in the area with information about an ongoing federal operation, but Marcus's radio volume was turned down, and his attention was completely focused on the woman he now considered a serious threat. "I'm going to remove the weapon," Marcus announced, approaching Sarah from behind. "Any sudden movements and you're going to have a very bad day." As he carefully removed the holstered pistol from under Sarah's arm, Marcus noted that it was a Glock 19, standard law enforcement issue, well-maintained and expensive. This wasn't some cheap street gun. This was a professional weapon. His suspicions shifted from drugs or petty crime to something potentially much more serious. Was he looking at some kind of organized crime? A gang member? Someone involved in the kind of high-level criminal activity that required serious firepower? "This is a nice piece," Marcus said, examining the weapon while keeping Sarah covered with his own gun. "Expensive. Not the kind of thing most people carry around. You want to tell me what someone driving a beat-up Honda is doing with a $1,000 pistol?" Sarah turned her head slightly, and Marcus caught a glimpse of her expression. What he saw there wasn't fear or guilt. It was frustration so intense it was almost palpable. When she spoke, her words came out in a rush. "Officer, there's something happening in this area right now that you need to know about. There's a federal operation in progress, and your stop is... Lady, the only thing happening right now is that you're going to jail for carrying a concealed weapon and whatever else I find in that car of yours." Marcus cut her off. "Federal operation? Right. You watch too much TV." But even as he dismissed her words, something nagged at Marcus. The woman's demeanor, her knowledge of police procedures, the quality of her weapon, the way she kept checking her watch. None of it fit together in a way that made sense. Still, he'd been a cop long enough to know that criminals often came up with elaborate stories when they were caught. Federal operations, undercover assignments, cases of mistaken identity. He'd heard them all. "I'm going to search your vehicle now," Marcus announced, "and I'm betting I'm going to find some very interesting things." As he approached the Honda's open driver door, Marcus's radio finally broke through his concentration with a burst of static and urgent voices. This time, the volume and intensity forced him to pay attention. All units, be advised we have a federal operation in progress in the downtown financial district. Do not interfere with any ongoing surveillance activities. Federal agents are operating in the area and may be in unmarked vehicles or plain clothes. Marcus paused, one hand on the Honda's doorframe, as the radio message sank in. He looked back at Sarah, who was still standing with her hands behind her head, and for the first time since the stop began, doubt crept into his mind. Any unit that has initiated contact with unidentified individuals in the target area, please respond immediately for coordination with federal authorities. The radio went silent, and Marcus found himself standing in a moment of crystalline clarity, where all his assumptions began to shift like sand beneath his feet. He looked at Sarah Washington, really looked at her, and began to see details he'd missed in his rush to judgment. The way she held herself under stress, the quality of her situational awareness, the professional-grade weapon, her knowledge of police procedures, her attempts to communicate something urgent that he'd repeatedly shut down. "Ma'am," Marcus said slowly, his voice lacking the aggressive authority it had carried moments before. "What exactly did you mean about a federal operation?" The urgency in her eyes had intensified, but now it was mixed with something that might have been hope. She glanced at her watch again. A gesture that Marcus was beginning to understand carried more weight than simple impatience. "Officer Johnson," Sarah said, her voice taking on a tone of professional authority that seemed to transform her from suspect to something else entirely. My name is Special Agent Sarah Washington, Federal Bureau of Investigation. My badge and credentials are in my wallet, which is in my back pocket. I need you to retrieve them, and then I need you to understand that we have about 3 minutes before a very dangerous person slips through our fingers. Marcus felt the world shift beneath him. The confidence in her voice, the way she'd identified him by name when he'd never given it, the sudden transformation from nervous citizen to commanding federal agent. It all hit him like a physical blow. But years of police training kicked in, warring with the growing realization that he might have made a catastrophic mistake. Anyone can claim to be FBI, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. I've heard that story before. Check my credentials, Sarah said firmly. Right back pocket, black wallet. And while you're doing that, I need you to understand that the man we've been tracking for 6 months is in a building 3 blocks from here, and my team has been coordinating with local law enforcement to maintain surveillance without spooking him. With hands that were beginning to shake slightly, Marcus reached for Sarah's wallet. As he flipped it open, his heart sank. There, unmistakably real and official, was an FBI badge and identification card bearing Sarah's photograph and the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent Sarah M. Washington, assigned to the Atlanta field office. Security clearance codes that meant nothing to Marcus but looked impressive and official. A federal law enforcement officer with more authority than he could ever hope to have. Marcus looked up from the credentials to Sarah's face, and what he saw there was professional patience mixed with barely controlled urgency. She wasn't angry exactly, but she was clearly dealing with a situation that was spiraling beyond her control. The operation, Marcus said weakly. You said there was an operation. David Chen, Sarah said quickly, taking back her credentials and weapon with movements that were all business now. International arms dealer, suspected of trafficking weapons to domestic terrorist groups. We've been tracking him for months, and today was the day we finally got close enough to gather the evidence we need to bring him down. As she spoke, Sarah was checking her watch, her radio equipment, and scanning the area with the practiced eye of someone whose job was surveillance and threat assessment. Marcus found himself following her gaze, and for the first time since the stop began, he started paying attention to his surroundings in a professional capacity. That's when he noticed things he should have seen from the beginning. The black sedan across the street with 2 men who were clearly law enforcement, one of whom was speaking urgently into a radio. A van parked at the corner with tinted windows and what looked like antenna equipment on the roof. A woman in business attire standing at a bus stop who hadn't gotten on either of the 2 buses that had stopped there during his traffic stop. How long have I been keeping you here? Marcus asked, the full magnitude of his mistake beginning to dawn on him. 17 minutes, Sarah replied without hesitation. 17 minutes, during which David Chen was supposed to meet with his contact in the Marriott Hotel lobby 3 blocks from here. 17 minutes during which my team has been trying to figure out why their inside surveillance suddenly went dark. Marcus felt sick. You were the inside surveillance. I was supposed to be in position 10 minutes ago, Sarah confirmed. My cover was perfect. Just another person driving through downtown, forgettable, invisible, until you decided that my car wasn't nice enough for this neighborhood. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Every assumption he'd made, every judgment call, every moment when he'd ignored what the woman was trying to tell him, it all crystallized into a pattern that he could no longer deny was rooted in prejudices he'd never wanted to acknowledge. The radio traffic, Marcus said suddenly, remembering the dispatches he'd ignored. They were trying to coordinate with the federal operation. And you were too busy proving that I didn't belong here to listen, Sarah said. Her voice wasn't cruel, but it carried the weight of professional disappointment that somehow felt worse than anger would have. Sarah's radio crackled to life, and both officers heard the voice of what was clearly a federal agent in command of an operation that was falling apart. Base to Surveillance 3, where are you? Target is moving toward the exit. We need eyes on the lobby now. Sarah keyed her radio. Surveillance 3 to base. I'm 17 minutes delayed due to local law enforcement contact. Approaching position now. Negative, surveillance 3. Target left the building 12 minutes ago. We've lost him. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus watched as Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, he could see the professional mask slipping to reveal the frustration and disappointment of someone who just watched months of work disappear because of someone else's prejudices. 6 months, Sarah said quietly. 6 months of careful investigation, of building relationships with informants, of coordinating with international law enforcement agencies. David Chen was finally within our grasp, and now he's gone. Marcus felt as though he was standing in the ruins of his own career, not just because he'd interfered with a federal operation, though that was serious enough, but because he was being forced to confront the uncomfortable truth about why he'd made every decision that led to this moment. "Agent Washington," Marcus began, but Sarah held up a hand. "Officer Johnson, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about one criminal getting away. David Chen has been supplying weapons to domestic terrorist groups, the kind of groups that target federal buildings, schools, churches. Every day he remains free is another day those weapons could be used to kill innocent people." The weight of that statement settled over Marcus like a crushing burden. He'd always thought of himself as one of the good guys, a protector of the innocent, someone who made communities safer. But in this moment, he was forced to confront the possibility that his actions had made the world a more dangerous place. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. Sarah was already walking back toward her car, moving with the urgency of someone who still had a job to do, despite the setback. "Now we try to pick up Chen's trail from what little information we managed to gather before your stop blew my cover. Now we hope that the months of work our team put into this operation weren't completely wasted. Now we start over and hope we get another chance before Chen supplies weapons for another Oklahoma City or another Pulse nightclub." As Sarah reached her car, she paused and looked back at Marcus. "Officer Johnson, I want you to think about something. When you saw me driving through this neighborhood, what was the first thing that made you decide I didn't belong here? Really think about it, because whatever that was, it just helped a very dangerous man escape justice." As the adrenaline of the confrontation faded, Marcus began to replay the entire encounter in his mind with brutal honesty. The radio calls he'd ignored, the urgency in Sarah's voice that he'd interpreted as guilt rather than professional concern, the way she'd immediately complied with all his instructions, like someone who knew police procedures intimately, the quality of her weapon, her situational awareness, her attempts to communicate something important that he'd repeatedly shut down. But underneath all of those professional observations was a question that made Marcus uncomfortable in a way he'd never experienced before. What had made him pull her over in the first place? He'd told himself it was police instincts, suspicious behavior, something not quite right about the situation. But as he stood there in the aftermath of his mistake, Marcus was forced to confront a much simpler and more disturbing truth. He'd seen a black woman driving an old car through a predominantly white business district, and he'd assumed she didn't belong there. The radio in his patrol car crackled to life, and Marcus walked back to answer it with heavy steps. The dispatcher's voice was professional but tense. "Unit 347, please respond to headquarters immediately for debriefing regarding federal operation interference. Supervisor requests immediate return to station." Marcus keyed the radio. Unit 347 responding. ETA 15 minutes. As he drove back toward the station, Marcus tried to imagine how he would explain his actions to his supervisor. How do you tell a superior officer that you stopped a federal agent because you thought her car wasn't nice enough for the neighborhood? How do you admit that your split-second judgments about who belonged where had potentially compromised a major federal investigation? But even worse than facing his supervisor was facing himself. Marcus had always believed he was a good cop, someone who served and protected without bias or prejudice. He'd gone through all the training about community policing and fair treatment. He'd always insisted that he treated everyone equally, regardless of race or economic status. Yet when he honestly examined his decision-making process during the traffic stop, he couldn't escape the conclusion that race and class had played a role in every choice he'd made. From the initial decision to pull Sarah over, to his aggressive questioning about her presence in the neighborhood, to his assumption that her claims about federal operations were lies, Marcus had been operating from a set of biases he'd never acknowledged. The radio crackled again, this time with a different voice. All units, be advised that the federal operation in the downtown area has concluded unsuccessfully. Suspect David Chen remains at large and is considered extremely dangerous. Be on the lookout for Asian male, approximately 45 years old, may be traveling in a late-model black Mercedes sedan. Marcus felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over him. Somewhere out there, a man who supplied weapons to terrorists was free because of choices Marcus had made based on prejudices he'd never wanted to admit he harbored. When Marcus arrived at the police station, he was immediately directed to the office of Captain Rodriguez, his supervisor for the past 3 years. Captain Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran of the force, a man known for his fairness, but also for his unwillingness to tolerate officers who brought disgrace to the department. "Sit down, Johnson," Captain Rodriguez said without looking up from a file on his desk. When he finally raised his eyes, Marcus could see disappointment there that cut deeper than anger would have. "I've just gotten off the phone with Special Agent Thompson from the FBI's Atlanta field office," Captain Rodriguez continued. He was very professional, very measured in his language, but the message was clear. One of my officers interfered with a major federal operation and allowed a dangerous criminal to escape. Marcus tried to find words, but Captain Rodriguez held up a hand. "Agent Thompson also mentioned that Agent Washington spoke highly of your professionalism once she'd identified herself as federal law enforcement. She apparently told her supervisor that you handled the situation appropriately once you understood what was happening." This information somehow made Marcus feel worse rather than better. Sarah Washington had protected him in her report, despite the fact that his actions had derailed months of her work. "Sir, I made a mistake," Marcus said finally. "I saw something that looked suspicious to me, and I acted on it without gathering enough information. I interfered with a federal operation, and a dangerous criminal escaped because of my poor judgment." Captain Rodriguez studied Marcus for a long moment. "Johnson, I've read Agent Washington's full report. I've also listened to the radio traffic from this morning, including the multiple attempts by dispatch to inform units about the federal operation. I want you to tell me in your own words what made you decide to pull over Agent Washington's vehicle." This was the question Marcus had been dreading. How do you explain to your supervisor that you'd made assumptions based on race and class without admitting to prejudices that could end your career? "Sir, I observed a vehicle that seemed out of place in the area," Marcus began carefully. "The condition of the car, combined with the driver's behavior, led me to believe there might be suspicious activity." Captain Rodriguez leaned back in his chair. "Johnson, I've been a cop for 20 years. I've made traffic stops based on gut feelings, and I've been wrong before, but I've never interfered with a federal operation because I couldn't be bothered to listen to my radio. I want you to really think about what made Agent Washington's car seem out of place to you." The silence stretched between them, and Marcus realized that his supervisor was giving him an opportunity to be honest about his motivations. Captain Rodriguez had probably read between the lines of the FBI report and understood exactly what had happened, but he was giving Marcus a chance to acknowledge it himself. "Sir," Marcus said slowly, "I think I made assumptions about Agent Washington based on her race and the condition of her vehicle. I think I saw a black woman driving an old car through a business district and jumped to conclusions about why she was there." Captain Rodriguez nodded slowly. "And those conclusions led you to ignore radio traffic, dismiss the agent's attempts to communicate with you and ultimately compromise a federal investigation. Yes, sir. Johnson, I'm suspending you for 2 weeks without pay while Internal Affairs reviews this incident. During that time, I want you to think very carefully about whether you're prepared to do the kind of self-examination necessary to continue being a police officer in this city. Marcus started to respond, but Captain Rodriguez continued. I also want you to understand something. Agent Washington could have filed a formal complaint that would have ended your career. Instead, she chose to focus her report on the operational failure rather than your personal conduct. That level of professionalism and grace is something you should think about during your suspension. As Marcus left the police station that afternoon, his badge and weapons secured in the captain's office, he found himself thinking about Sarah Washington. She'd had every right to be angry, to demand consequences for his behavior. Instead, she'd shown a level of professionalism that made his own actions look even worse by comparison. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus would find himself reading news reports about David Chen's continued criminal activities. Reports about weapons traced to terrorist attacks that might have been prevented if Chen had been captured that day in Atlanta. Each story would serve as a reminder of the real-world consequences of split-second judgments based on unconscious biases. But he would also find himself thinking about something else. The moment when Agent Washington had looked him in the eye and asked him to really consider what had made him decide she didn't belong in that neighborhood. It was a question that would force Marcus to examine not just his actions that day, but the assumptions and prejudices that had shaped his entire approach to police work. The suspension had given him time to reflect not just on that disastrous morning, but on his entire career and the assumptions that had guided his decisions. He'd spent those 2 weeks reading, thinking, and having uncomfortable conversations with himself about implicit bias and the ways prejudice could masquerade as police instincts. On his first day back, Marcus was assigned to desk duty while Internal Affairs completed their review. As he sat processing paperwork, he couldn't help but notice how differently he viewed the reports crossing his desk. Stories about suspicious persons, traffic stops, and routine patrols all looked different when viewed through the lens of what he'd learned about his own biases. Around noon, Captain Rodriguez approached his desk with a file folder and an expression that Marcus couldn't quite read. Johnson, I have an update on the Chen case, the captain said, settling into a chair across from Marcus's desk. Agent Washington's team managed to track him down 3 days ago in Houston. He's in federal custody now. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. That's good news, sir. It is, Captain Rodriguez agreed. But I want you to understand the cost. The delay caused by the blown operation in Atlanta gave Chen time to complete one more weapons sale. Those guns were used in an attack on a synagogue in Birmingham 2 days later. 3 people died, Johnson. 8 more were wounded. The news hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd known intellectually that Chen was dangerous, that his weapons ended up in the hands of terrorists and extremists. But hearing about specific victims, real people who had died because of weapons Chen had been free to sell thanks to Marcus's interference, made the consequences of his actions brutally real. I wanted you to hear that from me, Captain Rodriguez continued, because I want you to understand that police work isn't just about following procedures or making arrests. Every decision we make has the potential to impact real people's lives in ways we might never know about. Marcus stared at the file folder in front of him, unable to speak. 3 people dead because he'd made assumptions about a black woman driving an old car. 8 more wounded because he'd thought someone didn't belong in a particular neighborhood. The weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable. Sir, I don't know if I can do this job anymore, Marcus said quietly. If I'm the kind of person who makes those kinds of judgments, maybe I shouldn't be wearing a badge. Captain Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, studying Marcus with the experience of someone who'd seen many officers struggle with the realities of their profession. Johnson, do you want to know what Agent Washington said when I called to update her on your status? Marcus looked up, surprised. She asked about me? She said that in her 15 years in law enforcement, she's encountered a lot of officers who made assumptions about her based on her race. She said most of them, when confronted with their behavior, became defensive and denied that race played any role in their decisions. But you admitted your bias and seemed genuinely committed to examining it. Captain Rodriguez opened the file folder and pulled out a letter. She wrote this for your personnel file. I think you should read it. With shaking hands, Marcus took the letter and began to read. To whom it may concern, Officer Marcus Johnson's interference with our federal operation on the morning of March 15th was the result of assumptions and biases that led to a serious operational failure. However, Officer Johnson's response when confronted with his mistake demonstrated a level of professional integrity and personal honesty that is unfortunately rare in law enforcement. His willingness to acknowledge his biases rather than deny them suggests that he has the capacity for the kind of self-reflection necessary to become a better officer. While his actions on March 15th were problematic, his response to being confronted with those actions gives me hope that he can learn from this experience and become the kind of police officer our communities need. Marcus read the letter twice, then looked up at Captain Rodriguez with tears in his eyes. She's giving me a second chance, Marcus said. We all are, Captain Rodriguez replied. But Johnson, understand that this is your only second chance. The department is going to require you to complete additional training on implicit bias and community policing. You're going to be on probation for the next 6 months, and if you ever again let personal prejudices interfere with your professional duties, your career will be over. I understand, sir. Do you? Because this isn't just about following rules or avoiding complaints. This is about understanding that every person you encounter as a police officer deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of what car they drive or what neighborhood you think they belong in. Marcus spent the next 6 months working to rebuild his career and his understanding of what it meant to be a police officer. The additional training was humbling but educational, forcing him to confront not just his own biases, but the systemic issues within law enforcement that allowed those biases to go unexamined for so long. He also began volunteering with community organizations, particularly those focused on police community relations. Working directly with community members who had been negatively impacted by police bias gave Marcus a perspective on his profession that he'd never had before. 6 months after the Chen incident, Marcus received a call at work that he wasn't expecting. The desk sergeant told him there was someone in the lobby asking to speak with him, a federal agent. When Marcus walked into the lobby, he found Agent Sarah Washington waiting for him. She was dressed professionally in a dark suit, and when she saw him, she extended her hand with a smile that seemed genuinely warm. "Officer Johnson," she said, "I was in town for a court appearance on the Chen case, and I wanted to stop by and see how you were doing." Marcus shook her hand, still amazed by her professionalism and grace. "Agent Washington, I owe you an apology that I never properly gave. My actions that day were inexcusable, and the fact that people died because of my mistakes is something I'll have to live with for the rest of my career." Sarah studied his face for a moment, and Marcus could see her evaluating his sincerity with the trained eye of someone whose job required reading people accurately. "Officer Johnson, I've read the reports about your progress over the past 6 months. Your supervisor speaks very highly of the work you've been doing, both in your official duties and in the community. That tells me that you've learned something from what happened." "I've learned that everything I thought I knew about being a good police officer was incomplete," Marcus replied. "I've learned that treating people fairly requires more than just following procedures. It requires examining your own assumptions and biases constantly." Sarah nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of self-awareness that makes for good law enforcement. The officers who scare me aren't the ones who make mistakes and learn from them. They're the ones who make mistakes and refuse to acknowledge them." As they talked, Marcus found himself struck by Sarah's perspective on law enforcement and community relations. Her experience as a black woman in federal law enforcement had given her insights that challenged many of his assumptions about police work. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said. "Why did you protect me in your report? You could have ended my career, and honestly, maybe you should have." Sarah was quiet for a moment before answering. "Officer Johnson, I've been the victim of police bias more times than I can count, both as a citizen and as a federal agent. I've seen how that bias can destroy trust between law enforcement and communities, but I've also seen what happens when good officers learn to recognize and address their own prejudices. You had a choice after that day. You could have become defensive and blamed everyone but yourself, or you could have used it as an opportunity to become a better officer. You chose the harder path. The path you helped make possible by not destroying my career," Marcus pointed out. "Maybe," Sarah acknowledged, "but I think you would have found a way to learn these lessons eventually. Some people have the capacity for growth and self-reflection, and others don't. You do." As Agent Washington prepared to leave, she handed Marcus a business card. "If you ever want to talk about law enforcement, community relations, or dealing with implicit bias in police work, feel free to call. Officers who are genuinely committed to examining their own prejudices and improving their communities are rare. We need more of them." After she left, Marcus sat in the lobby for several minutes, thinking about the journey that had brought him to this point. The confident police officer who had made that traffic stop 8 months earlier had been replaced by someone who understood that good police work required not just training and procedures, but constant self-examination and humility. The victims of that Birmingham synagogue attack would never come back. The damage caused by David Chen's weapons would never be undone. But Marcus had learned that the best way to honor those victims was to become the kind of police officer who would never again let prejudice and assumptions override professional judgment and human decency. So what do you think about this story? Have you ever witnessed a situation where snap judgments and unconscious bias led to serious consequences? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story made you think about the importance of examining our own assumptions and prejudices, please subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories that challenge us to be better. And don't forget to check out the next recommended video, where I'll tell you about a teacher who was discriminated against during a job interview, only to reveal something that completely changed everyone's perspective. Remember, the way we treat others says more about us than it does about them. And sometimes the person we're judging might just be the person who could teach us the most about ourselves.